Okay, pastors and leaders, let's talk about some practical next steps for teachers. So let's say that you've gone through the first couple lessons with your pastor or whoever's training you. You're talking about whether you're going to be a preacher someday, or not a preacher someday, but you're going to teach on a Sunday morning, which is a great calling. Let's say you've talked about your qualifications, you got thumbs up on that, and you've started to understand the principles, the three principles for teaching as far as we see them. Well, so now what would you do? What's the next step? You might be meeting for 3 weeks now with a pastor, and you're like, well, I can go preach next week now? Well, no, hold on, not yet necessarily. I mean, it's ultimately up to the guy in charge at your church, obviously. But here are some practical next steps that we would recommend that you do to really make sure that you're ready to get up there, because you don't want to get up there prematurely. Preaching is really important. I mean, it can be a make it or break it experience for a newcomer in your church, for someone who's kind of on the fence. So just make sure you're ready for it. So here's some practical tips. Number one, we think you should practice with the talking points at small group. Now, hopefully you're already in a small group you're mentoring, so you're really familiar with how to use our talking points. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's talking points for every sermon. There's talking points for all of the other resources that we have, many of the other Pursue God resources that we have. We've got talking points in there for you. And hopefully you're getting comfortable using the talking points. In a small group setting, when you go through the talking points, you've got great clarity when you talk through those things. You're being concise. You're not, in a small group setting, you shouldn't be going through the talking points in 25 minutes. It should be, 5 or 7 minutes. Add some of your own flavor to it, add some of your own experience, add some of your own insights, whatever. So practice with the talking points in small group. That's the first thing I'd recommend that you do. And then here's another thing you can do. You can practice with the talking points at church. So you know what sermon's coming up this next week. So you go to the resources, go to the lesson resources, download those talking points, take some notes on those talking points while you're listening to the sermon. And you're basically taking notes for yourself, but you're also taking notes thinking, okay, what story would I have used there? What example would I have used there? Take some good notes. Fill that thing out with questions, comments, insights. Give yourself a rating out of 10. Like how comfortable would you be preaching that particular sermon? Write that up in the upper right corner of the talking points, and then sit down with your pastor later on and say, okay, hey, let's talk through this. Share those notes with your pastor and help him to understand. Those are some really practical ways for you to start getting confidence. Like, I could get up there and do that. I couldn't get up there and do that. So practice with those talking points with your sermon. Now, here's the next step. When you feel like you're ready, record a practice sermon video. So maybe you take one of those sermons that you just heard and you say, oh, I think I gave myself an 8 out of 10. I think I could preach that. Or I gave myself a 10 out of 10. I really believe I could preach that sermon. That's great. So take that sermon, take those talking points, set up your phone in your office or at home in your living room when the kids are in bed or whatever. And you don't need any microphones or anything like that. Just hit record on your phone and preach a sermon. I know it might be a little awkward at first, but try it. Just preach that sermon and use your notes. Try to do it like you're doing it for real. Try to do it in 25 to 30 minutes and then upload that video to your YouTube channel. If you're not sure how to do that, you can just click on how to get a YouTube channel. It's free. And then share that link with that video, share that link with your pastor or your trainer. Say, hey, I practiced this one. Give me your feedback on it. And let them grade you using that as that simple assessment form that assesses you based on those three things. How biblical was it? How engaging was it? And did you empower conversations? And do that. Practice. That's a great way to practice and gain some confidence that you really can do this. Okay, so then here's the next step. So let's say you've done all these things these first few steps that I've already laid out for you. You've practiced in small group. You've practiced by writing on the talking points during a sermon at church. You've recorded a video and you've sent it to your pastor, your trainer. So here's the fourth step. Repeat. All those things. Just keep repeating it till you get more and more confidence. And then the last thing I would encourage you to do is just to start small. When you finally feel like, let's say your pastor says, you're ready, let's do this. Start small. If you've got a retirement home service you could preach at, go do it there. If you have a men's event, a men's breakfast, go do it there. If you have a smaller service, let's say you have an evening service, do it there. If your church has multiple services, don't preach at all of the services your first time. preach at the first service of the day. Maybe it's a little bit of a smaller service. Just do that. And then for the other 2 services, let someone else preach, or, the pastor, or do the video there. Like, start small. Another great way to start small is to make sure to use the sermon intro video to set up your sermon. Even if you feel like, I can preach the sermon myself, it doesn't matter. You should still use the sermon intro video, because what it does is it connects you to the teaching team at pursueGOD.org. It connects you to us. It gives you some equity. It makes them feel like you've prepped it with us, which you basically have. So use that sermon intro video. But a lot of times in our resources, we'll also have a last point video that you can download. So you can play the sermon intro video, then you can preach 15 minutes of the sermon, and then you can play the last point. So you'd be surprised at how much easier it is to prepare 15 minutes of a sermon than 25 minutes of a sermon. So in a lot of those sermons, you have both the front end and the back end video available, and do that. That's a great way to get your feet wet, to make people feel like, you did great, even though you only taught for 10 or 15 minutes. It'll give you more and more confidence. So start small. So those are some great tips, practical tips for next steps. I encourage you now to use that discussion guide, talk about it with your pastor or your trainer.